I'm Simon. I'm here to tell you that you're listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix.
Welcome to the Decarbonisation Dialogue. Welcome to delivering on climate change, our collective challenge. I am Hannah Walker, and I believe that the best way to communicate a message is by being passionate about what you are talking about. Through that passion, I believe that you take people with you and create action, using your influence to make a change and make a difference. Our task today is to get all of us to net zero. Today I have Celeste Hicks as my guest, so thank you very much to Celeste. Celeste works at the Aviation Environment Federation. She joined in 2024 as policy manager. Her background is in campaigning and communications, having previously worked as a journalist at BBC World Service for 15 years and as a communications manager at Transport and Environment. She has had roles at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and is also the author of 3 books, including Expansion Rebellion. And Celeste is also volunteer campaigner on Safe Streets for Children and Clean Air for Mums for Lungs at her children's school. Welcome to Celeste.
Hello.
Thank you for joining us. So let's start by talking about your own career path and how you've pursued that, because you're a former journalist, a campaigner. I think you'll call yourself a campaigner, author, and you're also now helping shape policy. How did you get to this place?
The short answer is that I suppose as I got older, I started to just think a little bit more about what I considered to be the key skills that I have. And I started to think more about the sort of impact of some of my career choices on the environment. And I also had children. So I think, when I was working at BBC World Service, I was traveling a lot. So obviously when the children came along, it got a bit difficult to travel as much as I had done in the past. And then I started to feel that if I wasn't able to be there in person, I was feeling a little bit that I wasn't doing my best in that job. And then obviously I kind of started to think about the impact of all my flying as well, in terms of how that worked in the climate crisis. So yeah, I think it's been a long journey, mostly prompted by motherhood, I would say, that's kind of brought me to think more about, what do I really want to do? And yeah, I think in the end, I kind of saw that there was a great nexus between communications and policy, and that you can't really have one without the other. And I think sometimes people see communications as being one thing, and the communicators don't necessarily engage on the policy, and vice versa. You have a lot of policy professionals who don't really think about how to explain what they're trying to do to the wider public. So I think, yeah, I've sort of just naturally evolved into this space.
So writing very much a key to that development and how you've worked throughout the years. And you mentioned travelling with the BBC World Service, because of course you mentioned flying. It was an inconvenience, but of course now you're thinking probably about flying in a very different way as well, regarding your work. So which moves us on to the Aviation Environment Federation. Can you tell us a little bit about that organisation? Because you're campaigning on aviation's impacts for people in the environment. Can you tell us a little bit about that, and noise and air pollution and what's going on in our skies?
Yeah, so the Aviation Environment Federation is actually celebrating its 50th anniversary very shortly in September. So it started as an organisation that was reflecting the concerns of communities, mostly living around airports, who were bothered about air pollution and noise. So sort of in the 1970s and 1980s, there was a big increase in flights. And, anybody that's lived under a flight path will know how loud airplanes can be flying over people's houses. So it was a coalition of groups who came together to sort of reflect the interests of those people. A lot of work that we do is on noise and air pollution. And then in recent years, we've had to sort of take on the question of climate change and emissions from planes, which are large and significant and often get overlooked by people in the climate change debate. And we also work on all kinds of issues to do with environment. So at the moment, even today, we've been talking about PFAS, which were used in firefighting foam for a long time. And there's a big problem with PFAS around airports. And we also look at biodiversity impacts from airports as well. So really, yeah, we do what we say on the tin, anything to do with aviation and environment.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the impact your policies are having at that national level and even global level?
Yeah, so I think AEF has always situated itself as trying to be a kind of well-informed NGO voice. We don't go for anything dramatic protests or anything like that. But what we try to do is make sure that our arguments are backed up with really solid research. And so obviously we've been going for 50 years. So we do have a vast body of research that we've done over the years. And our website is a treasure trove of information if people are interested. So I think that gives us a really important role to play, because we are trusted by a number of organisations, and we do get asked a lot to be involved in things. So we have been involved in quite a lot of government meetings at the DFT and the Civil Aviation Authority. I mean, we were recently asked to call to give evidence at the Environmental Audit Committee, and several of our team members are sitting currently on the government's Jet Zero Council, which is looking at different ways to decarbonise aviation. So I think we really have an impact when it comes to considered policy that really looks into the detail and trying to get across the complexity of these things and the competing interests. And you mentioned about the global level. So AEF was one of the founder members of the International Coalition on Sustainable Aviation, which is a group of NGOs which have observer status at the ICAO, so that's the UN body for aviation, at their annual many meetings across the year. And there's an environmental part to that called CAPE, and we always go to those meetings and represent the collective views of NGO communities. So, that can be quite a slow process because it's a UN body. So obviously everybody in all the countries of the world get to have their view when these meetings take place. But, the detail is really where things are crucial there. And so we've been following that for a long time.
You mentioned there's a lot of references there to various organisations, and also there are a lot of targets we're facing. Now, I've got one figure here. For example, in April 2021, the government announced it will include the UK's share of international and shipping emissions in its carbon budgets and its binding target to achieve net zero by 2050. This means that the entire UK aviation sector will be part of the commitment to reduce economy-wide emissions by 78% below 1990 levels by 2035. What do you think when you think of the targets? Are we completely off target?
It's interesting you should mention the target to include international aviation and shipping, because actually that was something that AEF campaigned quite heavily for. Mm-hmm. And we were very pleased when the government committed to it. Because previously what had happened was, because aviation is between countries, there was a bit of disagreement in terms of who owns the emissions. So should it be the country where the flight's leaving from, or the nationality of the passenger? And nobody really addressed that at the UN system. So for a long time, they were left out. However, even though the government committed in 2021 to include those, we still haven't seen the statutory instrument that's necessary. So the secondary legislation needs to be laid before Parliament to make sure that actually happens. So that's kind of another thing that we're campaigning on at the moment. And to go back to your question about target, I mean, the short answer is it looks like we are not making very much progress in aviation towards those targets. So, for example, if we go back to the government's Jet Zero strategy, which was launched in 2021. Now, 2022. Now, of course, we know that the pandemic's happened since then, but a lot of the analysis has been done on the trends, sort of not including the impact of the pandemic. But it was when this was launched in 2022, the previous government said we would really like 2019 to be the highest level of aviation emissions. We would like this to be remembered as the year of peak aviation emissions. And we know that the provisional figures for 2024 are out now. We know that they're ever so slightly higher than they were, at least for international aviation emissions in 2024. And we know that passenger numbers are continuing to go up in 2025. So, we don't think it's early days to be able to make a proper analysis of that, but it looks like things are not going in the right direction. So it's quite difficult to imagine that there will be huge progress in the next 3 to 4 years to hit those 2030 targets, especially if airport expansions go ahead. And, obviously that means more flights. We try not to sort of focus on too many of the individual targets and look at the sort of bigger picture of the trajectory. And we can say with confidence that at the moment, the 2024 provisional figures are giving us the impression that the emissions are not going down at all from aviation.
So we know we're flying all over the place. We only have to look up in our skies. And as you say, you don't even need to live directly under a flight path to know that there's a lot of movement going on up there in the big airports, as well as obviously a lot of the smaller airfields. So you've got some clear asks at the Aviation Environment Federation around net zero emissions, including financial measures to limit flying around, such as air miles tax. It'd be nice to talk about some of that and how that would impact all of us, because there is also some basics in there. Just don't fly as much, getting those airport staff possibly to transition to green jobs. What's your response in terms of getting people to look at alternatives?
So the idea is that if you look at who actually flies in the UK, the people who fly multiple times a year are predominantly richer people with more disposable income. And we know that a huge chunk of the flights that depart from the UK are for leisure purposes. And the airports are kind of quite open about that they want to open more leisure destinations. So, what we try to do is raise awareness of the fact that a lot of that growth in airports and growth in passenger numbers is being taken by richer people. And if you look at the impact of flying compared to other activities that people do, the impact of flying is huge. It's one of the most climate impactful things you can do, in a negative way, not in a good way. So I think what we want to make sure people understand is that, no one's saying don't ever fly again, but we're just sort of trying to raise this question of is the never-ending growth in the number of flights actually serving anybody other than rich leisure passengers who want to go on more and more holidays? And do we think that that's a social good? And if it's a social good, is it worth the carbon cost that will eventually be placed on all of us, because we will have to cover the costs of that in the future? What you were mentioning about what we call a frequent flyer levy is the idea that the more that people fly, the more they pay. So it's kind of like a tax on people who fly. We haven't actually developed this research ourselves, but our partners, Possible and the New Economics Foundation, have developed this research quite a lot. And they propose anybody who flies more than 6 times a year as ultra frequent flyers. And the idea is that they pay more. And obviously, we've seen some progress from the government with the increase in air passenger duty on private jets, which came in the Chancellor's autumn statement. So we want more of that. We want more of taxing the private jets. We want more of taxing first class passengers and business passengers, because they are more polluting, because obviously they take up more space than an economy passenger. So the emissions per passenger in first class and business class are more. And, just to put that in context, it's the UK passenger service, a survey that shows that only about 50% of the UK population fly at all in any given year. So, 50% of people don't fly, and yet the pollution is being done by a tiny proportion of wealthy people. We're just really keen to get that across and make people understand that, those costs will be borne by everybody. And is that fair?
Technology. Let's talk about technology for a moment, because do you think that's part of the problem, or do you think it's part of the solution? Because you're asking and wanting to see the aviation industry invest in more research, development of net zero energy technologies available. How do you feel about that at the moment, the technologies and how they can be used to help us turn things around?
Zero emissions flight, I'm sure, will be possible in the future, but right now it's a huge challenge just because of the weight of the batteries. If you're looking at electric flight and the relative power that you need to take for a plane to take off, it's not like a car in terms of how much propulsion you need. So we're very behind as a global, the global approach to zero emissions flight is very behind. We think that probably at some point that those technological challenges will be solved, but they're certainly not being solved now. And the big aircraft manufacturers, which really is just Airbus and Boeing, are not putting the research and development money into these technologies at all. Airbus recently announced that its hydrogen plane technology program was being delayed by several years. So, they've been saying for a while that they'll have a hydrogen plane by 2035, but they've now delayed that. The other option you have is to decarbonise the fuels. So obviously, I think we've all learnt some lessons about biofuels in the past and how they can indirectly cause land use changes, which actually can paradoxically increase emissions if you're chopping down virgin rainforest to plant palm oil to put into cars and then burn. So the UK SAF mandate, so Sustainable Aviation Fuel mandate, came out at the beginning of this year. And the idea is to use waste-based feedstocks for producing aviation fuel. That's great, and we're supportive of that, and we want to see more of it. Unfortunately, it's not kind of at the moment things are not going quite as quickly as they need to. We need to scale from a tiny proportion of sustainable aviation fuel available now to meet our 2030 and 2040 and ultimately 2050 targets. And even the aviation industry knows that sustainable aviation fuel is not the answer, the full answer. There will be other things will be needed, including things like greenhouse gas removals, the zero emissions technology that I told you about. So these are the reasons why we find it difficult to understand why you would take the risk of increasing airport capacity and inducing more demand by allowing airports to expand at a time where really the decarbonisation technologies are still in their infancy and they're not scaling as fast as we need them to.
So we're not going fast enough, and the technologies could be there, but there needs to be a real kind of commitment and energy about driving those forward. So I'm interested in your work with your members and those kind of experiences that those people have, because you work with the Parliamentary Transport Committee, Environmental Audit Committee, and a number of organisations, the Airport Council, International Airport Carbon Accreditation Schemes, etc. But I'm interested to know about your members' experiences we're looking to the future, but what is it like? What do they tell you about the noise and the emissions in terms of living under that flight path? What do people tell you? What do they come to you? What kind of stories do people tell you about what it's like?
So I think our members are one of the really sort of most important factors of AEF, because we do represent communities, and other NGOs don't necessarily have that community voice that we employ when we go to speak to the government. And I think it opens doors for us because we do represent people and we can speak on behalf of people and communities. And I think that gives us extra credibility when we're presenting our ideas to the government. I mean, the stories we most often hear are, I would say the biggest problem is night flight noise for people that live near airports. So people who have been woken up by planes coming in very late at night, early in the morning, and even during the night. There are rules around night flights in the UK, but there are many thousands of sort of dispensations, they're called, every year, where planes are delayed and therefore they have to come in the middle of the night. And that also goes to during the day as well. If people are sitting in their gardens trying to enjoy their gardens and enjoy peace and quiet, if they've got planes flying over it, it can be very triggering for a number of people who sort of feel, who are bothered by noise and just find that their sort of personal space and privacy has been invaded by that. There's a huge problem with air pollution around airports, and some of it's to do with traffic. So people driving to the airports and road congestion around airports, but a lot of it is also to do with what's coming out of the back of the planes as they come over communities and land, and dropping ultrafine particles and other things, soot, nitrogen dioxides, sulfurs dropping on communities as they fly over. There's also all kinds of impacts to do with, for example, children's learning. Children that live in schools near big airports kind of can't concentrate because of the noise and the interruptions. And there's been a lot of research recently about the impact on people's cardiovascular health, and some quite clear evidence that there's a direct link between people who live under flight paths and increased cardiovascular problems. So all the people that contact us are living this in one way or another. And we got contacted a lot by people where there are threats of airport expansion. So people realise that their house, which doesn't have any aircraft noise currently, may well be affected by aircraft noise in the future, and they don't know where to go. They don't know what help they can get. We try to help them. We also get contacted a lot by what's known as general aviation. So this is kind of like private pilots and small aerodromes where there's people flying their own planes and helicopters and private jets for some of them, airports like Farnborough. And there really isn't really much regulation around those at all. The flight paths around those can change quite suddenly. So people can suddenly find themselves bothered by multiple planes and small, loud aircraft going over at lower altitudes. And we try to reflect all of those concerns when we get the opportunity to meet with the CAA and the Department for Transport.
Do you feel optimistic, or do you feel that that you've still got a huge amount of work to do, or never ending, actually?
I mean, it is never ending. And I think what's interesting about it is that sort of what you do in aviation touches on all the other sectors. And I think this is kind of one of the things that we spend a lot of time doing, is just looking, for example, if you want to create what's known as e-fuels, which are basically synthetic fuels using captured carbon and green hydrogen, which is produced using renewable sources, that's often touted as one of the best solutions for decarbonising aviation. But, our research has led us to understand that means you're taking away renewable electricity from the grid, which is also needed to decarbonise people's homes and to decarbonise transport. So all of the solutions that you look at for aviation, there's already kind of other economy-wide impacts. And so, I think that's the bit that keeps us busy is trying to pull those elements together. I think part of the reason for that is just sort of historically aviation is just kind of, I'm sorry to use this phrase, but under the radar. It's been quite a small proportion of global emissions up until quite recently. When Kyoto Protocol was formed in 1990, it was a tiny proportion of international emissions. So no one was really worried about aviation. And obviously there's been enormous growth in global aviation since then. But for the aviation industry, they like to keep it like that. They like to say, well, we're not that big a problem. But the problem we're facing now is that while other industries are decarbonising, we've made massive strides in the grid intensity of carbon. We're doing really well on EVs. Aviation is really not doing anything. And I think that it's frustrating right now because every way we look at it, you can see the impact of aviation. In fact, the Climate Change Committee said in the report to Parliament recently on the progress towards net zero that if aviation doesn't hurry up and get on with it, it's going to become the biggest emitting sector in the UK, in the whole UK economy by 2040. And it's already emitting more than the power sector is. Big questions will be asked about that and need to be asked about that. So I feel optimistic in the sense that, what I enjoy about this job is the intellectual challenge of it, because it's fiendishly complicated and things fit in and all kinds of technological advances and sort of legislative and planning bills and all of this stuff, it all comes together. But actually, however you look at it, there's a big problem with aviation and people are just hoping it goes away, and it's not going to. So I think if you think maybe 10 years down the road, I think we will see a lot more progress because it is already becoming obvious that aviation is way behind where it needs to be.
It clearly has to be addressed because, like you, I see directly a lot of the passion that goes in from people across the country addressing all of those buildings, our houses, homes, etc., to decarbonise. Get rid of those old fossil fuels, look at renewables, etc. And there is a little bit of puzzle still about what's going up in the skies. And I don't think that people will forget about it because your work at the Aviation Environment Federation seems to be making a difference. And it's good to see that you've got a voice there. And thank you very much to Celeste for being a guest today and talking about all things aviation. It's highly complex and for sure there's still huge amounts of challenges, and I know we're on a race, so time is really not on our side in terms of climate change. Thank you to Celeste Hicks for joining us today from the Aviation Environment Federation. There can be no doubt that climate change is the biggest challenge of our time. Today, we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions to slow global warming. Today, we must act for tomorrow, adjusting our lifestyles to current and future impacts of climate change. Today, we must use our collective wisdom to deliver on our climate commitments. Today, we work for tomorrow's world. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast channels, and please do email your views and suggestions to podcast@salixfinance.co.uk. We'd love to know what you think. Thank you once again to Celeste for joining us today. Thank you, Celeste.
Thank you.
I'm Zoe Hurst, and I'm here to tell you that you've been listening to the Decarbonisation Dialogue, a podcast from Salix. For more information about our work and to find more content, please visit salixfinance.co.uk/podcasts.